All right. So welcome everyone. I am excited to be here. I want to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with some housekeeping items first and foremost before we get started, but we're waiting for individuals to chime in. I am Dr. Sherry Smith. I am the Director of Academic Success here at TrueLearn. Let me go over some housekeeping things before I introduce our presenter. You're listening using your computer speaker by default. If you'd like to change your audio settings, go ahead and refer to the audio pane or your control panel from GoToWebinar. It will look like a little audio dial. You can change your settings there. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to to Dr. Agarwal by typing your questions into the questions pane on the panel. And so it'll say questions. I see that some of you guys have already started submitting questions, which is great. You can send questions in at any time during the presentations, and we'll collect them and address them either throughout the presentation or at the dedicated Q&A session. If we're not able to get to it, we will follow up with you after the webinar to address any questions that you may have. Okay. All right, so it's 7:30 on the dot. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Research-Based Strategies to Study Smarter, Not Harder. Here at TrueLearn, we refer to her as one of the gurus of retrieval practice. And I'm not going to spend time introducing herself. I'm going to allow her to do it. So without further ado, I'm honored to be passing the mic over to Dr. Pooja Agarwal.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I am an assistant professor of psychology at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. I've spent about 15 years doing research on how people learn and remember, specifically on how students remember, and what we can do as teachers and what we can do as learners to help us retain more information. And so I'm really excited for the opportunity to share research that I and my colleagues have conducted and research in my field about how we can genuinely study smarter and not harder. I know that there is a lot of information that you have to retain, and I am very thankful that you are joining us here today for this webinar. So we will go ahead and get started. And one question I just like to start with that all of you may already know the answer to is how many bones are in the adult human body? If you could go ahead and put them into the chat. I'm curious how many bones are in the adult human body. Go ahead and take a guess and type it into the chat. I see we've got 306 from Jesse, 206 from Lori Ann, 205, 206. More guesses? Don't cheat. 310, 273. This is great. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to put in your guess. No idea. And if, of course, when babies are born, they have a different number of bones. So that's why I specified for adults. And the correct answer is 206. So we'll be coming back to that in a bit. I did want to mention that I have a book that's been recently published called Powerful Teaching, Unleash the Science of Learning, where my co-author, Patrice Bain, is a veteran K-12 teacher, and we share the research from cognitive science about how to help students learn and remember from both a K-12 and a higher ed medical education perspective. So that is available. I'll show you in a bit a list of more books on the science of learning that I highly recommend, especially from the learner perspective. So I do hope you'll join me on Twitter at RetrieveLearn, and the book's available on Amazon Kindle audiobook. So the questions that I'm so glad you submitted when you registered, here are just some of them that came up that I want to make sure that we address today. So one is, how do I make time to study? I know that you have a lot on your plate. What's the best way to take notes? How can I retain more information during all of that studying? And how do I balance this with everything else? So I hope during some Q&A we can talk more about creating a study schedule or what you can do with all of the clinical practice and the research and everything else you have going on. So what I hope to share and convince you of by the end of this half-hour webinar is that you don't need to make more time to study smarter. We're actually going to use your time in a more valuable, effective way. I'm going to share some research-based tips on how to take notes more effectively. All of these strategies I'll talk about can take 1 minute or less, so it's not even that you need to spend more time studying. It's just taking the time you already have and helping to boost your long-term learning, so that these strategies help you study smarter and not harder. And in the long run, what I love about this research and these strategies is that they will ultimately save you time. If you can remember more, then you don't have to keep restudying the same information. So here's what we're going to do in our short time together. I want to share 4 guiding principles from the science of learning and cognitive science, some very quick practical strategies. I'm going to be sharing a number of them. I hope that you can take away at least 1 or 2, if not all of them. We'll have time for a more general Q&A, but again, feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar. And I want to talk about next steps. So what happens even if you get interested, excited about applying these strategies? What are some more tips you can use to really put this into practice tomorrow? And here are the 4 key principles from cognitive science. I have a lot more information about these on my website, retrievalpractice.org. So I'm not going to delve hardly at all into the research. Again, there's a lot on my website, and if you're looking for time to study, then you may not have time to dig into the research, but it is there available. The 4 key principles that I love talking about are retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, and feedback and metacognition. And the reason why these are guiding principles are for a few reasons. One is that there's research going back more than 100 years demonstrating that these 4 strategies do improve long-term learning. There's also a lot of research demonstrating that these strategies improve a wide variety of content areas, from foreign language and science and math to medical education and psychology, and also that these are flexible for all ages. So it isn't that these strategies only work for K-12, they actually work for infants, they improve learning for college and medical students, even for older adults. So I'm just going to give some quick examples of each of these key principles. And these are all strategies I hope you can think about incorporating as questions for yourself. The first strategy is called retrieval practice, this idea of simply retrieving information, pulling it out from memory instead of just trying to shove information in. Now, of course, a lot of prep that you all do with TrueLearn and other QBanks and test prep is this idea of retrieval practice. But sometimes when we study, we tend to default back into getting information into our heads instead of getting information out of our heads. So one question I like to ask my students when I teach at the college level, and one question you can ask yourself is just simply, what are 2 things you learned today? I'd like to give you just literally a minute. I'm going to pause and give you a minute to type out. You can write it, you can type it, we'll talk more about notes, or you can put it into the question box. Just what are 2 things you learned today? I'm sure you probably spent time with patients or studying or in medical school or in classes and courses and lectures. What's at least 1 thing that you learned today? I'd love for anyone to share in the question box, or again, feel free to take your notes. Amy says that today they reviewed the coagulation cascade. Stephanie learned about the prone position. Cameron and fetal SVT treatment. Raphael, how to set up a room for an aneurysm repair. These are great. Keep going. What else have you learned today? See, and I'm not grading you. This is absolutely no stakes, and it focuses on getting that information out. I'll share just a tiny bit of research on this as well. But take this time for you to really improve your memory. Even just that simple retrieval of 1 thing will boost your long-term memory, as opposed to just rereading your notes or trying to review recordings from a lecture as well. Great, so feel free to keep typing in some things you learned today. An example of the principle of spacing is to space out what you're learning. So you could ask yourself, what are 2 things you learned today? But it's also beneficial to ask yourself, what are 2 things you learned yesterday? And we often ask this for children, what'd you learn in school today? Nothing, right? You can ask children as well, what did you learn in school yesterday? And there's a mental struggle, what we call in the scientific literature, a desirable difficulty. And that mental struggle, that difficulty is what improves learning. So it may actually feel a bit uncomfortable to think back, what did I even do yesterday? Or what did I do last weekend? But that little bit of effort with spacing is going to also boost long-term memory. So you're welcome to go ahead and type in one thing that you learned yesterday. Let's see, today is Thursday. So what is one thing you learned yesterday on Wednesday? I'll provide more examples of how to combine retrieval, spacing, interleaving, and feedback as well. The third guiding principle is what we call interleaving. And this is really important, I think, especially for skills learning. And interleaving is this idea of mixing things up in order to help discriminate the similarities and differences. So an example from the book Make It Stick that I highly recommend, it's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning by my Ph.D. mentor, Henry Roediger, and my colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis. With interleaving, an example they give is of a batter at batting practice. So let's say the batter is receiving pitches, the pitcher is throwing fastballs, curveballs, and changeups or sort of slow balls. And let's say that the pitcher is throwing 10 fastballs, 10 curveballs, 10 changeups. The batter literally knows what is coming at them. They know, okay, this is a fastball, I just had 10, now I'm going to switch to a curveball, and so on. With interleaving, if that pitcher simply randomly orders the pitches, then the batter no longer knows what's coming at them. They have to think on their feet and figure out, okay, what is the strategy or skill I need now? So particularly for those of you who are surgical residents, to think about how can you interleave different types of knot tying or different types of simulations that are related, but instead of sort of plugging and chugging and just doing the same thing over and then the same thing over and then the same thing over, what are some similarities you can mix up to discriminate as opposed to categorizing or lumping things together? So for instance, when it comes to the Q bank at TrueLearn, you might want to think about randomizing some of the questions across multiple subject areas instead of just sticking to one subject area. So that's a bit about interleaving. The fourth one, feedback and metacognition. Metacognition is a simple idea of thinking about our own thinking about our own learning. And one powerful strategy for improving long-term learning is called a confidence judgment. And this could be something you do while you study. You could do this while you're using Q banks, is to mentally take note or even to create checkboxes for yourself where you just think to yourself, did I nail that question or am I not sure? So it's great to be practicing retrieval, going through Q banks, quizzing yourself, but this slight added step that takes 10 seconds to make this metacognitive judgment of did I really know that or did I not, then helps with when you get feedback. You can see if there was a disconnect. Did I think I nailed it, but actually I didn't, or was I not sure, but I got it correct? So that little extra step really doesn't take much time to improve learning and your metacognition. I did want to mention this tiny bit of research. So again, I was at Washington University in St. Louis for about 15 years and conducted research with the authors of Make It Stick, again, Henry or Roddy Roediger and Mark McDaniel. And we did a lot of research in the classroom. Our colleague, Doug Larson at Washington University in St. Louis at the med school has done research looking at retrieval practice and spacing with improving medical students' neurology diagnoses, the use of standardized patients in quizzing as opposed to just studying a review sheet. And Dr. Larson's research demonstrates that pulling this information out with quizzes is much more beneficial than, again, just sort of going through the motions when it comes to reviewing or rereading notes. Recently, my colleagues and I completed a thorough review of the literature. We screened about 2,000 abstracts and narrowed it down to 50 experiments from 37 studies. Here I've highlighted in red the studies that are from medical classrooms and medical education. So I hope that you can go back if you're interested and look up this research. I also have it available on my website. The link there is at the top, retrievalpractice.org/review. So you can access the full database for a review of the literature. But there is a growing amount of research, especially in medical education, demonstrating that these strategies improve even complex higher order learning like CPR skills, diagnoses, nursing education, dental education as well. Here's a quote that I think sort of drives this point home for Make It Stick that I really like. Learning that's easy is like writing in sand, here today and gone tomorrow. And I'm sure many of us have experienced this. It's intuitive, right? Sometimes things are just so easy and it feels like it's there. And then when it comes to the time of needing to remember it, it's suddenly kind of gone. And that can give us this really anxiety-provoking feeling of, I forgot it, I need to cram for the ABSCITE or the USMLE. What do? I have to pull an all-nighter on top of my rotations and research and everything else. And what we tend to do when that feeling happens is we default to some of our study habits that are so ingrained in us since high school. And one of them is rereading and highlighting. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that rereading and highlighting improve short-term learning. So in that sense, they work. If you reread and highlight right before a college exam, so for instance, I took Greek mythology in college, I'm sure that I crammed, I reread my notes, I highlighted the textbook, I probably aced the exam, but then within a week, I forgot everything. I really can't tell you hardly anything for my Greek mythology class. And so what these types of strategies do is they create these illusions. Oh, I got this. I know this because I've been rereading it. It feels fluent, but then that can make it harder for us to determine what we do and don't know. So what happens ultimately is, even though these improve learning in the short term, of course, for many medical students and residents, you're trying to study over the long term. And you're maybe starting to study for the ABSCITE a few months in advance or even a few weeks in advance. And if you're not remembering anything, you have to keep re-studying the same thing and rereading the same thing. So I want to give you some strategies about how to stop re-studying, and these strategies will help you study smarter and save you time. So here are a few of them. One is that simple strategy I had you engage in of writing down, retrieving 2 things you've learned. This can take 1 minute or less. You could do it at the end of a class lecture, at the end of a chapter, at the end of the day, end of the week, end of the month. Think about if you were to keep these 2 things in a notebook, in a journal, in a Google Keep note, in an app, you would essentially have built yourself up notes over time of the important key points that you have retrieved. Now, you could always fill that information back in with feedback for yourself, but it really doesn't take much time. Again, this helps us switch from rereading and trying to get information into our heads to change that into getting information out of our heads. Another strategy that some educators call a brain dump is to simply write down everything you can remember. Now, to me, this is a bit more challenging. There's research demonstrating this improves learning. In the scientific literature, we call this free recall. But writing down everything you can remember helps with that retrieval, but it also helps us organize information. You could do this, let's say, for 5 minutes, or even give yourself 2 minutes. You don't have to write down everything you know about coagulation, for instance, but even just simply doing a sort of free-flowing, free thought retrieval can improve long-term learning. Again, it doesn't need to be involved. You've got the notes in front of you as well. And this is akin to what I call retrieve taking. Instead of note taking, it's sort of a spin on retrieving your notes instead. So let's say you're reading a textbook chapter, it's kind of dense, you're wanting to sort of aggregate, reorganize, pare down all of that information. What I suggest is going ahead and reading the chapter without taking your notes simultaneously. And once you're done reading the chapter or even half the chapter is to close the book, retrieve your notes, and then continue reading. So rather than taking those notes simultaneously as you're reading, is to maybe take literally 30 extra seconds to just close the book and retrieve your notes. So you're retrieve taking instead of note taking. I know that one can feel even more uncomfortable than simply writing down two things. So I'll give you some more tips about how to become a little more comfortable with some of these strategies. So again, retrieve taking is the same thing as note taking, just simply retrieving instead. I wanted to note some research-based tips when it comes to flashcards. Flashcards are great for retrieval. Here are 3 tips that are really important based on research. And I think of this as sort of the lather, rinse, repeat idea. So the first step is to make sure you're retrieving, especially if you're using handheld flashcards. Too often we might cheat ourselves or think, yeah, I know that, and you flip it over. There's a lot of research demonstrating that overt retrieval is important for learning. So you could say the answer out loud, you could write the answer down, you could quiz with a friend. But that first step is to retrieve. The second step is to reorder or shuffle a deck. This is another example of interleaving where mixing things up can help. Flashcards again are great, but if you're going through the deck in the same order, start to finish, you're going to get really good at that first half of the deck and not the second half of the deck. So make sure that you are shuffling or interleaving it. And the third tip is to repeat. Some of you had asked this question, is it good to repeat retrieval? And the answer based on research is yes. This is some research by Catherine Rawson at Kent State University and Jeff Karpicki at Purdue University, where it's important to retrieve multiple times. Just because you got something correct doesn't mean it's solidified. It could just have been a guess. So make sure you're retrieving correctly a few times. So if you have questions at this point, we have a few minutes left. Please go ahead and type them into the box. In the meantime, while you are typing your questions in, I wanted to give you some really quick points about common questions I receive when it comes to studying. A common question is, should I handwrite or type my notes? Based on research, the correct answer of sorts is that there doesn't appear currently to be a reliable difference. Now, we definitely need a lot more research in the cognitive science literature. A colleague of mine, Heather Uri at Tufts University, just put up a preprint of research where she and colleagues were not able to replicate a study that came out in 2014. You may have heard of this study that came out in 2014. It got a lot of press demonstrating that handwriting notes is better than taking notes on a laptop, but that research hasn't been replicated. So this is where I say you do what works for you, whether it's handwritten or typed. Another question often asked is, should I listen to music while studying? The answer is no. There is research demonstrating that that is a distraction. Humans are very bad at multitasking. We think we can do it and we can't. It might feel like it keeps you alert, but if you're retrieving, for instance, that's going to be a better use of your time, and that's going to keep you more alert than listening to music and rereading a textbook, which is just a waste of your time. Another tip regarding where should I study? No, it doesn't really matter. There's research called context-dependent memory, but it's also not very reliable. There hasn't been much of it done. So yes, you could set up a routine and always study in the same place, but I think it's more important, there are more effective strategies like retrieving as opposed to worrying if you're sitting in the same room. There are some misconceptions when it comes to learning. One of the most pervasive myths is about learning styles. There is research demonstrating that learning styles is not something, adhering to a learning style does not improve your learning. You have preferences for listening to an audiobook instead of reading a book, but research demonstrates that you're not necessarily going to learn more if you are taught in your learning style, or if you study in that way. In fact, research demonstrates that by challenging ourselves with different ways of studying, we remember more than if we sort of pigeonhole and categorize ourselves. So learning styles is a myth. There's a lot of information by Daniel Willingham, and recommend a New York Times op-ed he wrote a while back on learning styles. Another tip about brain games, no, they do not improve learning. You can do crossword puzzles and Sudoku and all of these computerized games, but all they do is you get really good at the games. They give you this illusion of confidence again. I'm getting good at these games, so I must be getting smarter. And there is no quick fix in that way. Brain training games have very little transfer. You get good at what you practice in the same way that if you retrieve information, you get good at what you practice. But I encourage you to be mindful of not spending money on brain games. The most important thing when it comes to staying cognitively aware and on point are really sleep and exercise, which are yet another difficult thing to fit in, especially in medical school and residency. But don't waste time on brain games, get in a quick nap instead. A few next steps, and then we'll have time. I'll get to some of these questions I see popping up. I just want to give you a few more tips. One thing is to just spend a little time reflecting on your own strategies. I've noticed that students don't do this very often, and I definitely didn't even in my own graduate school program, is just to think about how you study and why you study that way. Did someone teach you? Is it something you kind of developed over time? And does it work? My guess is it may work in the short term, but not necessarily in the long term. So take a minute and think about your own study strategies. Some additional tips is to make sure that you are quizzing yourself on all questions, not just the incorrect ones. I noticed that some Q banks let you choose if you want to quiz yourself on only the incorrect ones or the ones you haven't done before. Based on research, really try to repeat that retrieval, not just on the questions you got incorrect. When it comes to spacing, research suggests that there's not necessarily an ideal amount of spacing. In general, the more the better when you can. But asking yourself, what did you learn yesterday or what did you learn last week is a great simple way of spacing. In terms of interleaving, again, consider using a random selection of questions. If your QBanks or apps like Anki, if they allow for that, I do think they have shuffle features. So keep that in mind to interleave questions. And keep in mind, it's very beneficial to receive feedback on what you've gotten correct and incorrect. So often we've been handed exams back and we just rush to see what we got incorrect. But when we get feedback on correct answers, again, it solidifies that information. It improves long-term learning for that as well. So you may be wasting your time, honestly, if you're just giving your feedback for incorrect answers. You want to make sure you retain what was correct as well. And lastly, you might want to try these strategies with low stakes materials. So let's say you're trying to remember names and faces after a networking event, or you want to remember some details about a patient. That way, if it feels less stressful than trying to do one of these strategies with the AppSite, for instance, try this with something low stakes. Trying to retrieve something you learned about the last documentary you watched, trying to remember something about the last book you read. So try this with low stakes material. It doesn't just have to be for test prep. A few reminders, I know we're running short on time, is to keep in mind that how you do now with these strategies is not how you'll do later. Again, rereading helps in the short term, but retrieval helps in the long term. So try to stick with these strategies. That challenge is a good thing for learning. So even if it seems like it's not working, just try it for maybe even a week. Again, doing some of these strategies, implementing them with something low stakes can be really helpful. I'll leave this slide up for just a second. Some more research I recommend that my colleagues have published, and I'm going to look through these questions real quick. The best strategies for retention closer to exams from Lorianne Edwards. Cramming. Cramming works really well when it's close to an exam, and that gets into the nuances of if you're trying to remember or if you're trying to do well on the exam. While studying, should I write notes in bullets or sentences? This is a great question. I would recommend thinking about that brain dump idea or free recall. When you actually free recall it, that helps you organize. So if you free recall in sentences, and then you can go back and put bullet points. But I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of research in terms of how structured note-taking should be. There's this concept of Cornell notes, but there definitely needs to be more research on that. Sorry, oh gosh. It looks like the Inky flashcard app does automatically shuffle cards. That is great. I'm sorry, I can't see. Try to look through a few more. You can follow me on Twitter at RetrieveLearn, and my website again, retrievalpractice.org. If you tweet at me, I will also try to answer some of these questions. A few books and podcasts I really recommend on the science of learning I have on my website, retrievalpractice.org/students. It's specifically a list for learners of great podcasts. NPR has something called the NPR Life Kit about study strategies. I'd recommend Make It Stick. I recommend books by my colleagues Jana Weinstein and Megan Sumeraki. There's a book, Learn Better, by Ulrich Boser. So I have a list of about 15 books if you have more time for those, but also about 70 podcast episodes for students. And I'd like you to take just a moment, maybe even just 30 seconds, if you can retrieve one thing you'd like to remember from this webinar. I'd love for you to type it in, or you can tweet at RetrieveLearn. But what's just one thing you'd like to remember from this webinar? You spent half an hour with me, so I hope that you will think about that as well. And Christopher Riley got it. How many bones are in the human body? They are 206. So I hope you'll remember that, of course. Thank you so much for joining me. I can stick around for just a few more minutes, but I'll turn it back over to Sherry. So thank you all so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pooja. We truly appreciate working with you and having your time today. What I'm going to do is Ariel and I from TrueLearn on the back end, we're going to take all your questions down and hopefully try to answer them ourselves or work with Dr. Agarwal to answer these questions, and we will send it out to you guys so that you can review. If at any time you'd like to contact us, feel free to do that through support at TrueLearn. Again, you can tweet Dr. Agarwal as well, or follow us on Twitter, and we hope to continue to have some of these sessions in the future if they're helpful. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you so much, guys, and have a wonderful evening.